Inside the Birds is back. What's going on, everybody? It's Geoff Mosher and Adam Caplan for another Inside the Birds NFC East preview show. We've done Washington, we've done the Giants, so we're going to move on to the Dallas Cowboys here on Inside the Birds, presented, of course, by our friends at Ocean Casino Resort in Atlantic City, the exclusive Jersey Shore resort of Inside the Birds. And we don't do this by ourselves. We do it with the man, Greg Cosell, who helps us break down all of the NFC East teams. Greg, we will break down the Cowboys now, and then we'll finish off this series with the Eagles like we do every year. You've been grinding the tape. The last two teams we've asked you about, Washington, New York, we've sort of gotten this discussion about everything new, the draft, sort of the refurbishing they're trying to do. The Cowboys might be the complete opposite. Sure, they have a new defensive coordinator. We'll get into that. But from a roster standpoint, they probably lost more than they've brought in. And they look very similar. So I'm sure you look at the names and they pop out to you from all the tape that you've watched from them.
Yeah, but I think they've got, do you want to start on offense? Because I think they've got a couple of significant questions.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Let's go. What jumps out?
I mean, we'll get to Prescott, and obviously that's important. But right now, they really do not have a running back that you can count on. And I think that's really important for them. Obviously they re-signed Zeke Elliott, who's not Zeke Elliott anymore. And that's based on tape study. I hope people understand that when I make those comments. It's not a take, it's not an interpretation. It's based on what he's put on tape the last couple of years. And I don't know if they view him as a back that's going to carry 220 or 230 times. My sense is he can't really do that at a truly high enough level to have that kind of volume. That's what the tape the last couple of years has shown. The other question that relates to that is they lost Tyron Smith at left tackle, so now they're playing a new left tackle. They did draft Tyler Guyton out of Oklahoma in the first round, who played right tackle at Oklahoma. And while I thought he was incredibly gifted athletically, he's only played 14 games at right tackle in his college career. So you're now moving him theoretically to left tackle. And I don't know if they expect him as a first-round pick to be their starter, but I would imagine there would be meaningful growing pains, even though the athletic and physical traits are there to potentially become a very good player.
Yeah, because remember, 2 years ago we talked about Tyler Smith, and the talk was, where do you line him up? Who knew he'd be this good? So that's a good story for them.
It happened fast, and you're right.
I know there was probably one of the most unlikely stories talking to coaches, NFL people. They just didn't see him being able to do this, come from the program he went to, and being able to play at this high enough level. But Greg, you talk about Guyton's their new left tackle, but they also going to have a new center. You would think Cooper Beebe would wind up winning it. What are your thoughts on Cooper Beebe?
Cooper Beebe, to me, was the kind of player, it's probably centers his best position because he's very stout. He's kind of sawed off. He does not have long arms, but he's physical. He's aggressive. He's tough. Usually those kinds of players, Adam, play in the league and center, and they play inside. And he played guard in college for the most part at K-State. He actually played some tackle there as well, but he was never going to play tackle in the NFL. In an ideal world, I think they would like him to win that job. He was a third-round pick, which is probably where he should have been drafted. I think he was a 4-year starter, so he has a ton of experience playing in college football. Like I said, those kinds of players tend to play because inside, and it took me years to learn this. When I first started years ago watching college tape, I was very focused on athleticism and feet when I watched interior O-linemen, and then through just experience and learning from offensive line coaches who obviously know way more than I do. Inside, it's not about looking pretty. Inside, it's about battling, fighting, being technique driven. You just have to compete sometimes. When you're facing the really good D tackles in the league, sometimes it's not about looking sweet. It's just about getting them blocked. And Beebe is that kind of guy. He's probably a tempo setter type player in terms of how he plays.
Let's go back to the run game with Ezekiel Elliott, as you mentioned, returning as the lead back. Tony Pollard no longer there. Didn't have the greatest year last year as a volume carrier that they asked him to be. Is there anybody here in the backup ranks, Greg, among Rico Dowdle,
Huh.
Bruce Vaughn, Royce Freeman, that you think or that you've seen on tape some encouraging signs of maybe being that 1A or a heavily used backup complement?
Ooh,
Your side just gave it away.
you know, I mean, I technically don't. I mean, there's one back that they have who's, um, I think, a free agent because he was not a Cowboy, and I think it's his second. Is it his second year in the league or third year in the league? And again, he may not even make the team, but I remember watching him in college, named Snoop Connor.
Mm.
And he's a big physical downhill runner. And again, because he's a free agent and he's probably fifth or sixth on their depth chart right now as we speak at the end of June, he may, like I said, he could be cut tomorrow. We have no idea, but he's a big physical kind of explosive downhill guy. He's a little tight hip, so he's not loose and and he's not elusive and shifty, but you know he's a certain kind of back, and they may need that kind of back. Again, with Zeke, unless something changes, unless normally that doesn't happen. I mean, how many guys can you think of that have had his volume throughout his career, have kind of went downhill for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden were great again? I mean, I'd be hard pressed to think about. I'm sure there's someone, but I can't really think of who that might be.
I mean, Emmitt Smith, Greg, and ironically, Cowboys, you got to go back a long, long time. I just remember him sort of, okay, this looks like he's on the downward slide, then he kind of regained it, but that is extremely rare on your point. At that,
Yeah,
there becomes a point in year 7, 8, or 9 where the running back's legs, they're just not as good.
yeah.
And he's now this grinding back, and it's stunned. Look, it's okay to bring the guy back, but for him to be their starter, I mean, it's not like they're going to like they're not going to run the ball, and that
Yeah,
would
I
worry me.
remember. I forget who I was talking to years ago. It was when LaDainian Tomlinson, who's obviously one of the great backs of all time and a Hall of Famer.
Mhm.
And I remember when he got later in his last year or two. Okay, and I remember talking to a coach, and it was years ago, so I can't remember the coach, but it was obviously a coach, someone who knows.
Mhm.
And he said the one thing to look at when backs really start to lose it is they don't work well in confined space and they lose their balance more quickly. And that's been evident with Zeke Elliott the last year or two. He was a master to run really well in this league, to be the kind of back he was, a high volume back who worked inside mostly. You have to be really good in confined space. You have to be able to navigate that both with lateral quickness and with contact balance. And you have to have some kind of balance and physicality. And Zeke was as good as there was at that, but not the last couple of years.
Right. So that sort of leads to the question philosophically on offense, Greg. Dak Prescott, I remember talking to you about Dak last year and how he was really starting to understand his role as a West Coast offense quarterback in Mike McCarthy's offense and starting to move around a little bit more. If the first read wasn't there or second read wasn't there, do you see this with this lack of running game maybe becoming more like a 65-35 older Andy Reid mid 90s, West Coast style offense where they're just going to come out and try to spread the ball around with their tight ends and their wide receivers and make the running game just be honest?
I mean, I don't think they want to play like that, and I don't think they'll start off playing like that. It may end up being like that, Geoff. I mean, I don't think they're going to go into the season with the idea that, let's just toss it all over the yard. I don't think they want that to be the offense.
Right.
It's funny because within the last week, I watched a ton of Prescott. And I actually watched all of CD Lamb's targets, and then I watched a ton of Prescott, which obviously included CD Lamb, but it also included the other players. And I think that Prescott, and he had a great year last year. People can say what they want. He had a great year last year. And I felt, and Brian Schottenheimer is there as the OC, and he's really good, by the way. It doesn't get talked about enough. Their pass game is really well schemed. It's well designed situationally. It created some really well-defined reads and throws for Prescott. And people can say what they want, but Prescott is a higher level pocket executor and ball distributor. That's his game. And last year, he actually showed more than he had in recent years in terms of getting out of the pocket and making outside of structure plays. But at his core, he's a pocket player. And he was really very, very good a year ago.
Couple things here just to add. McCarthy calls it plays, but on Greg's point, Schottenheimer is a big believer, believe it or not, in data and analytics. Like, he's got a background in it, really sharp guy. So the aggressiveness with the pass game last season, I'm talking to people who've worked with Schottenheimer before that probably came with Schotty and McCarthy's ear. Yes, McCarthy, it's his scheme. He calls the plays, but on Greg's point, Schottenheimer's been around a long time. He's been a play caller. It didn't work out with him and Pete Carroll, but Russell Wilson's best ball of his career was in 2020.
Was under Brian, without question.
Yes, that was the best Russell ever played by far. Super aggressive, coming out, throwing the football, and then Pete Carroll didn't want it, and that it didn't work out for Brian. But I don't know the guy. I'm just talking about what I know in the background. So this is, if you're a Cowboys fan listening, I know they're out there. Brian Schottenheimer knows what he's doing, and good for McCarthy to have a guy who's been there and done that.
Yeah, Brian's really good. I do know Brian, and I've spoken with him over the years. But he's really and he's respected in the league. He's really considered to be really good at what he does. So, and you saw it last year. Like I said, I probably watched 300 dropbacks over the last, week or so. And you can just see, when you see a really well-schemed pass game, and you guys know I've been doing this a long time, it just shows up right away. You can just see it, how the spacing of routes, how situationally what they put out there, and they do a really, really good job.
So I want to focus on their tight ends, which should be a strength of them. Jake
Without
Ferguson,
question.
yeah, we saw him emerge last year, even though they drafted Luke Schoonmaker in the second round out of Michigan. Sort of begs the question: will they look to try to get more 12 personnel in this year, Greg? And really, when you watch tape of Ferguson, what I'm curious is, assuming as he keeps improving, is he in your mind up there with, Dallas Goedert or whoever's a 3, 4, 5, 6 tight end, or how would you compare the games of him and the elite tight ends?
Close to that category. I mean, he does have seam ability. He's a pretty athletic kid. I like Ferguson. I think he's a really good player. And I really like Schoonmaker when he came out of Michigan. He just didn't get a lot of targets because of the way Michigan plays. But he was drafted in the second round for a reason, because people saw the athleticism. Both those guys are athletic, moving tight ends. And because of their college backgrounds, Ferguson, Wisconsin, Schoonmaker, Michigan, they're both really good blockers. They had a lot of college experience as attached blockers. So they're really complete tight ends. They could line up in 12 personnel. Obviously, they're still looking for that number 3 wideout. They're hoping this is the year it's Jalen Tolbert, who started to get more snaps toward the end of last season and made some plays here and there. He was a third-round pick 2 years ago, so it's his third season. They really don't have anyone. I mean, they drafted a kid in the 6th round this year who I didn't watch his tape coming out, so I can't speak about Ryan Flournoy. I don't know, Adam, if you know anything about him, but they're really counting on Tolbert to be that third receiver.
Yeah,
they are.
Go ahead, Adam.
I was going to say Jalen Brooks, number 83, is a guy that did some good things in training camp. That's why he made the roster. But on Greg's point, it's kind of like Tolbert or bust, because Gallup's long gone now. He's with the Raiders.
Yep.
And Tolbert did nothing his first year, started to contribute last year. And by the way, Brandon Cooks is on the last year of his deal. So there's some stuff they've got to quite figure out for the future here.
That's true. I mean, and Lamb is obviously, I mean, I watched all his targets. Interesting conversation with coaches that I've had this off season. If you ask them, like, name the top receivers in the league, the really top guys, the names that immediately came up are the obvious ones: Jefferson, Chase, Adams, AJ Brown. And then when you get to the next guy, it's funny, even though Lamb put up huge numbers, led the league in receiving, people are like, is he in that category? I think so, maybe not sure. But he's obviously really good, you know. And they move him around. They do a great, that's another thing they do. They do a phenomenal job moving him around. He's not just in one spot. Approximately half of his targets come outside, half of his targets come in the slot. He goes in motion at times. I mean, it's hard defensively just to say, let's stop CD Lamb.
Right.
because obviously that's the way teams think, but they do a really good job of moving him all around the formation.
And that was probably their biggest change, right? From the Kellen Moore offense to Mike McCarthy taking over with Shoddy, is that it wasn't CeeDee Lamb probably more slot, like 65-35 in Kellen Moore offense, but now it seems more 50-50 where he plays
Yeah.
outside inside.
Yeah, yes, that's very fair.
Yeah.
And the other thing they do, and I think this is a shoddy thing, is because I remember having this conversation with him a couple of years ago. They like to run empty formations. And you can do that. Obviously, a veteran quarterback really allows you to do that. Because obviously defenses have to pretty much declare more often than not. Nothing's 100% in the league, but Prescott, with his experience, is very good before the snap of the ball. In fact, that's one of the things he does really, really well. He's one of the better pre-snap quarterbacks in the league, recognizing pressure looks, coverage indicators. He does a really good job with checks and audibles. So they run a good amount of empty formations.
I tell you one thing that comes to mind just going through this Cowboys offense, Greg, with these tight ends and receivers. And Adam and I just had an interview recently with former Eagles quarterbacks coach John DiFilippo. And
Yeah.
he was talking, and this was for our Patreon members. He was talking about the 2017 team that had Selleck and Ertz, and they would play a lot of 12 personnel, but it would be 11 personnel formationally
Correct.
because Ertz would play the slot. And if you're telling me the Cowboys can have Schoonmaker in line, Ferguson in the slot, and Lamb outside with either Tolbert or Cooks or whoever they want, that's not an unexplosive 12. That's a pretty difficult matchup right there. I think that
No,
might
because
be
both those tight ends can run the seam and have
right.
some kind of vertical ability. I
Yeah.
mean, you're not limited. You're not limited formationally. Great point, Geoff. You're not limited formationally, and you're not limited with your route concepts.
Right. And especially if that kind of formation or that personnel grouping makes the defense counter with an extra linebacker instead of an extra D-back because they see the 12 personnel on the
And that's
field.
what you have to do. That's the first thing defensively you have to decide
Right.
when you play a team that lines up in 12. If both the tight ends can move, you have to decide, how am I playing it? Am I playing it in my quote unquote base defense with only 4 DBs? Or am I, that's one reason, by the way, you've seen the proliferation of big nickel.
Right.
With teams line up with 3 safeties. In effect, it's their base defense, but they play 3 safeties.
Sure. Excellent stuff. All right. We will turn the page on offense and get into defense in a second. First, we're going to pause to hear a word from our great friends at Ocean Casino Resort in Atlantic City.
Go to get your game on. Go for the beers. Go for the cheers. Go for the hit and the hits. Go for the stakes and the stakes. Go to get your parlay on. Go to get your party on. Go for the scene. Go for the screens. Go for the gallery. Go for the win. Go to Ocean. Visit theoceanac.com to plan your visit.
Okay, we're continuing our preview of the Dallas Cowboys 2024 season. The team that probably nobody saw this a month into last year, but after the Eagles implosion, the Cowboys wind up winning the division at 12-5, making it, was it how many straight years, Adam, of a different champion than the year before the NFC East? 03-04?
Yeah,
was
04 is
last.
yeah, the Eagles won what, 4 in a row? 01 to 04?
Yeah.
Right?
So that would be the 20th year, right? Last year, where you had a different champion than the year before, amazingly. So that's what the Cowboys are facing a little history here, Greg, or trying to beat history this year. Now, defensively, they're going to have a philosophical shift here, you can imagine, right? From Dan Quinn leaving and then being replaced, then bringing back Mike Zimmer to be the defensive coordinator. I have a little thought on that I'll share with you guys in a little bit, but I wanted your thought first.
Well, it'll be different. I mean, Quinn, the last couple of years, the Cowboys were among the league leaders, close to 50% of their snaps versus the pass. They played cover 1. They were a man-heavy defense. Now, they've got corners that I think prefer to play man, and Diggs will be back this year, obviously. So Diggs and Bland, I think, like to play man. Bland had a ton of interceptions last year, but I tell you what, as the year progressed, he got burned a lot. And because of the interception numbers, there was this sense that this guy just had a phenomenal year. He really didn't when you watch the tape. Teams went after him in the second half of the season with success. So he needs to improve. But, obviously he's one corner and Diggs is the other. And Diggs, everybody knows what Diggs is. He's very gifted. He's long. He's athletic. He can run. He's physical. But he's a cluer and a keyer, and you can beat him. So it'll be interesting. Zimmer is not a pure man guy by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
So this defense will look different. They were a very heavy, big nickel defense, 3 safeties. He may not go that route. Who knows? The one player they do get back, who was a 3rd-round pick in 23, who missed all of last season, is DeMarvion Overshawn, the linebacker from Texas. And a lot of people liked him coming out. He's a very athletic kid. I did his tape. A very athletic kid. They signed Eric Kendricks, who was in Minnesota. Obviously, Zimmer knows him. They very well could play with 3 linebackers as their base, do a true 4-3. Damone Clark had a really good year last year. He's a really good-looking player. So they could play 4-3 as their base without question. They're counting on Mazi Smith, the D tackle, who's their 1st-round pick a year ago, who really did not do much last year, but is really gifted and big to come on and be, a force in the interior of their defensive line.
So Micah Parsons obviously really flourished under Dan Quinn, Greg.
Yep.
And looking, because again, they're playing a different defense now. So do you see Parsons playing with his hand down more here, or how do you see that in this scheme?
I think he'll be in this defense, and I could be wrong. I think in this defense, I would think he's going to be a full-time DN. Because to me, they're not going to. I don't think they'll make him a full-time linebacker, but I think that he'll be a full-time D end. And the big question is, Adam, when you get to those pass rush situations, are they going to move him around the way that Dan Quinn did? Zimmer has normally, if you just go by what Zimmer's done in the past, now people change. He's been out of it, but he's a super smart guy. Obviously Parsons is incredibly effective when you start moving him around. So that's what we don't know.
He has been a line games guy, though, right? Throughout his career, like twist stunts, like he's always figured a way to get some free rushers.
Early on, and again, I don't want to say he pioneered it because that's I never say that because in researching for other things, like when I did the book with Jaws, I saw so many things going back to the 60s. So I don't want to say that he pioneered it, but he was one of the first to use a lot of that double mug look, where you'd have basically 2 linebackers in each A gap, and they didn't automatically blitz, but they were there, and it demanded that the protection deal with it because a back has to step in, and therefore the back can't free release. So that helps the defense right away because the back can't be a primary route runner.
Well, it's interesting. So he brought in old friend Paul Gunther, who's been
Paul's there now.
Yeah. So and those guys have worked together for so long. Double A gap blitzing, all the stuff that they brought in. Paul learned in Cincinnati, learned also with Marvin Lewis, believe it or not. Paul started his career with Washington when Marvin was their defense coordinator. So this is going to be interesting to see what they bring in here. So a couple more players here, Greg. Tank Lawrence, DeMarcus Lawrence, he's been in the league a long time, 10 years.
Yeah.
Where is he? What does that tape look like from
good?
him?
He's a good player.
Still good.
Okay. But they, again, they moved him around last year. He played end, he played tackle. The Cowboys, this is another point that's really worth making. The Cowboys were among the league leaders a year ago in the use of multiple stunt concepts. They were really good with their stunt concepts. And they moved all these guys around. I mean, the guy they lost, who's now in Washington, Armstrong, he was a major part of that as well. So I don't know if Zimmer is going to continue to do that. That's what we don't know. But they were among the league leaders in stunts, and they were really good at it.
I want to go back to Mazi Smith with you, Greg, because you said struggled a little bit. We all loved him coming out of Michigan. All thought he would be a pretty good player. Still think he has the opportunity. But when you watch the tape, where is it that he just struggled to translate at the pro level? Is it that what he was being asked to do, or?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, he didn't play a ton of snaps relative to what we thought he might play. I remember watching him in detail coming out of Michigan, and there were times I didn't think he was that far removed from Jalen Carter. 320-pound guy, really light feet, powerful. Obviously, the Cowboys felt the same. They drafted him, I think, in the early 20s in the first round. and it just didn't show up on tape. Again, I to be honest, Jeff, I can't tell you why that happened, but it just didn't show up when he played.
Gotcha.
But he's got those traits.
Sure.
And my guess is that, barring anything unforeseen, he's penciled in right now as a starting D tackle, and they expect him. I'm not saying he's going to be out on the field for 90% of their snaps, but I would bet they expect him to be out there 50, 60% of their snaps.
Mm-hmm.
So Greg, a guy that we like coming into this draft is Marshawn Nealon, the
Yeah.
second-round pick. Let's talk about him. How do you think he could do in this game?
I think it wouldn't surprise me if he was drafted because of Zimmer, because he was a really fun guy to watch in college. Now, again, he went to Western Michigan, so it's not a Power 5 school, but this guy has size, arm length, mass. He's got a textbook power profile. I mean, this guy is a speed to power conversion guy. And he had really strong athletic testing measurables at the combine. This guy's got short stroke strength and movement power. I mean, he shocked offensive linemen at his level of college football. And his whole pass rush was built on that speed to power conversion, really strong, heavy hands. And when you speak to coaches, Adam, they tell you that normally translates.
Interesting.
Yeah, obviously they'll have to make up for that. They had a pretty decent third guy in Dorrance Armstrong, who we talked about, is now with Washington.
As is Fowler, who was there a year ago as well.
Right. So they're looking for him, and the guy you mentioned, the rookie there, and maybe Sam Williams with another year under his belt.
He's a very talented guy, by the way, as well, Sam Williams. So they still have guys.
Yeah. So that leads me to my sort of big picture observation on this Dallas defense that I'll share with you guys in a second and get your opinion. First, we'll pause real quick to hear a word from our friends at Sky Motor Cars.
Sky Motor Cars in Westchester is a different sort of dealership. All it takes is one look at their Highline pre-owned vehicles that people all over the country want and need. Owner Brett Schiller, make sure you don't spend a dime of your money before you purchase the car. Sky Motor Cars allows you to make all the decisions regarding your next vehicle. At Sky Motor Cars, you never have to spend more than necessary. Visit SkyMotorCars.com today or call 610-918-7225.
And if you hop into Sky Motor Cars out there in Westchester, PA, make sure you tell them Adam and Jeff sent you. You will get a great deal. So maybe I have just too much time to think in the off season, but I feel like the trend, the going from, you remember when Tony Dungy built the Buccaneers, but they didn't win it all until John Gruden took over and just kind of brought them over the hump. I just feel for what the Cowboys have defensively, personnel, which is a lot of good players front to back. I almost feel like Mike Zimmer coming in, stabilizing them, doing some things different philosophically, Greg and Adam, not being so man coverage as Dan Quinn was. And I think that'll be better for this defense. I really think he has the opportunity to maximize the efficiency of this defense and the excellence of it by doing things a little bit differently than Dan Quinn did. Because it did stick out to me that as good as Dallas defense was, there were times against the run they were very not good. And then again, that Green Bay game, there were just guys wide open at times. You play so much man coverage, it almost forces you to be so perfect on every play, especially with those corners, their flaws that you mentioned, Greg. So maybe a little more zone or a little bit of a different identity here with Mike Zimmer really recognizes the talents of this defense.
That may be a fair statement. Again, we don't know that, Jeff. I mean, I know you're just presenting, kind of a thesis that obviously we won't know until they play the games.
Right.
But I mean, I can only tell you what the tape showed. And Bland, like I said, he struggled in man down the stretch. He really did. Teams went after him. I mean, that's the key point is, with Diggs out and, they were going after Bland, which, if teams viewed him as a big time man type shutdown player, I hate using that word because there's so few of those guys. But I mean, people see the interceptions and what the 5 or 6 return for touchdowns. He was really good. He had one particular trait. He was a master at playing kind of off coverage and jumping throws underneath him.
Right.
That was his thing. And he was really good at that. But in terms of matching up and playing man, he really struggled down the stretch. And don't forget, prior to last year, he was their slot corner. And he was really good in the slot. Now, they moved him outside out of necessity. He may be a better slot corner.
Yeah.
One guy, speaking of that position, or at least nickel, Jordan Lewis is back again, man. He's been with him a long time.
Yep.
Do teams go after him? What are your thoughts on him?
I haven't studied him in great detail. I think, obviously they think he's solid. He's been there because they drafted him. So he's been there since 2017. I think he's a solid slot. Would I say he's among the best slot corners in the league? Probably not. But I think you can line up and have him be your slot corner. I mean, unless they're going to move Bland there, which I would doubt very strongly, because I don't think they have another outside corner right now that you're going to feel comfortable with. Jordan Lewis is going to be their slot corner.
Greg, there was a guy, speaking about outside corners, you were talking to us about Nashawn Wright. Now, I know he hasn't really played a lot, but he's long. He's 6'4", Greg. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, well, they by the way, they drafted a corner this year out of Wake Forest, Caitlin Carson.
You liked him, right?
I did like him.
Yeah, I thought that's who Adam was about to ask about when you said that corner.
No, but right, because I just remember you talked about a couple years ago.
Oh, right. Usually, Adam, and again, he came out in 21, and so I can't remember, every detail when I studied him. But you know how it is in the league. If a guy has traits and he's long, that usually gets guys drafted. But sometimes those guys struggle then with their hips and their change of direction and their transition, all those terms we use when we study guys, and they just end up struggling, particularly depending on the defense you play. More often than not, those guys end up being better in press, because then they don't have to react in off coverage when a guy's running at them. And that's where the loose hips and the transition become more a factor. Press, it's not quite like that. But Carson, I thought Carson had a chance, and we'll see. Maybe you go through training camp and he ends up being a guy that they feel that they can put out there.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up on the Dallas Cowboys preview here for 2024. A lot of good players on this team, Greg. I mean, you can argue 53. They're up there with anybody else as far as upper echelon talent. And I know a big discussion has been about, are they about to have to make Dak Prescott, Micah Parsons, and CeeDee Lamb the highest paid players at their position when their contracts are all worked out and said and done? But that is a discussion for another day. And the Cowboys will try to defeat history and win the division back to back for the first time in, well, it would be over 20 years if they wind up doing it. That'll do it for this episode of Inside the Birds. And of course, we'll wrap it up with part 4 on the next podcast. That'll be our Philadelphia Eagles preview. For Greg Cosell and Adam Caplan, I'm Geoff Mosher. You've been watching Inside the Birds, the leading podcast in Eagles intel. And as always, we thank you for flying with us inside the birds. Be sure to check out our friends at PHLSportsNation.com. They're enhancing the fans' experience with their coverage of all Philadelphia sports teams. For the fan, by the fan is their motto. So make sure you check them out at PHLSportsNation.com and on Twitter at PHLSportsNation.